All right, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 11 of the Robots Are Coming podcast. My name is Ken,
My name is Michael.
and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Roland Vogl, and he's a scholar, lawyer, and entrepreneur who, after more than 15 years of academic and professional experience, he's developed a strong expertise in legal informatics, intellectual property, and innovation. And currently, he is the executive director of the Stanford Program in Law, Science, and Technology, and a lecturer in the law at Stanford Law School. So could you introduce a little bit more about yourself, Roland, about your work, and about how you kind of got there?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to join you for this podcast. I wear different hats at Stanford. So one you already mentioned, I'm executive director of the program in Law, Science, and Technology. But I'm also executive director of CodeX, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. And that's a joint center between the Stanford Computer Science Department and the Stanford Law School that concerns itself with research into computational law. And by that we mean the automation and mechanization of legal analysis. And I think that's perhaps apropos the theme of your podcast on help, the robots are coming. So I look forward to talking with you about that in the context of the legal domain. Anyway, so our center's mission is to bring information technology to the legal system and make the legal system more efficient for all stakeholders in the legal system.
Yeah, so the intersection of law and CS is something we hear about, and we hear about AI like replacing doctors, pharmacists, replacing call center workers, and maybe now it's also replacing lawyers. Do you think that is law just another field that AI is going to change in very drastic ways? Or is it perhaps, or do the two fields have a different kind of dynamic in which they can progress along in parallel?
So I think AI it has already had a tremendous impact on the legal field. So not just the legal profession, but the legal system more broadly. It will have an even more, even greater impact in the future. I would, however, not go as far as to say that the robo-lawyers will be replacing human lawyers. I think they are already in certain areas replacing handling tasks that human lawyers or other professionals working in the legal profession were handling in the past. But for the most part, these technologies are used to enhance what lawyers do rather than replace what lawyers do. So I would say that concept of the robo-lawyer has been talked about much. I would say it's, say 5 years ago, there has been a lot of excitement about this concept. It has, and this idea of the robo-lawyer replacing the human lawyer, I would say there are two aspects to that notion. And I think they're the kind of the process automation aspects of the robo-lawyer, also the aspect of computable contracts, these kind of self-executing contracts. That's one aspect where you could say that's a robo-lawyer. Then I think most people maybe associate that idea of, these kind of legal chatbots that allow people to kind of navigate through a particular area of the law and you ask questions and get answers, to get your visa application or to challenge a parking ticket. There's many examples for that out there. That's one aspect of the robo-lawyer. Those techniques generally use, for the most part, kind of rules-driven AI technologies. that work, with a sort of explicit representation of the law in a computable form, so that you can then do these kind of interactive Q&A applications. But the other aspect of the robo-lawyer is the one that's also been very much talked about. That's the aspect of the sort of these data-driven technologies being used in legal settings to do things like, identify, certain risks in large sets of contracts. It's called contract analytics, or to do what's called judicial analytics to predict, how judges will decide a certain case or decide on a specific notion. That's what we call these kind of big data law applications. And that's also an aspect of the robo-lawyer. And that's almost that aspect of the robo-lawyer that for a traditional lawyer is somewhat more threatening, because that ability to be able to predict how a judge will decide a certain case, or how other certain legal outcomes, that's something that lawyers have traditionally viewed as being very much based on their own experience, that they earned over many years of legal practice. And now when you have systems that can go through large amounts of data and make as good or even better predictions, that's potentially disruptive to traditional lawyers. Anyways, the long and short of it is that I feel that, the world is getting ever more complex. Laws are getting more complex. There are more and more laws. Technologies get more complex. They raise new legal questions. I feel as long as they're humans, there will be new kinds of human disputes and new kinds of human transactions that will need human lawyers to find solutions to them, to help resolve them. But these human lawyers will have a host of tasks that are, of the kind of data processing data processing tasks, and other tasks that are much more effectively handled by machines. And these lawyers will leverage those technologies to deliver their legal expertise to the client. And at the same time, I feel like there will be more kind of workflows and automated workflows that allow people to navigate through certain areas of the law in a fairly automated fashion. Those will be systems that will be more affordable than human lawyers, and more accessible, and they will be smart enough, those systems, to understand when a situation is not clear-cut enough perhaps to just go through the workflow, and when a human expert needs to be involved, when does a certain issue need to be escalated to a human expert. And so I think there will be more areas. There are tons of areas, I would say, where that are kind of low-hanging fruit for automation, and there's tons of opportunity for smart entrepreneurs and developers to create solutions to that. These kind of legal chatbots, solutions for a variety of different areas. But for for these other areas that are not they cannot be handled immediately through these automation techniques, we will see lawyers we see sort of a hybrid of kind of human legal advice that will be delivered in a sort of technically enabled and more sophisticated way. And the lawyers, that's one thing that I always say, the lawyers that will get in on this game, where they can sort of match where they can turn their services, that are based on their knowledge as lawyers, into products and workflows and systems that can be made accessible to people, they will do really well, I think, in this sort of changing environment. Sorry, that's kind of a long-winded way to answer your question, but anyway.
I think it's excellent. You bring up like many dimensions of progress of tech in law, and I just wanted to get your thought on recent headline, which is a Stanford grad who created Do Not Pay. It's a startup that helps average citizens sue anyone, anywhere. They raised 12 million in Series A, and it really feeds into the hype, like you mentioned, of this robo lawyer, and they do claim to be the first robot lawyer. So are you familiar with this startup, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yes, I'm familiar with Do Not Pay. I'm familiar with Joshua Browder. I have a lot of respect for him and his work, and he is definitely a trailblazer in that space. And I think there's there's an opportunity now to bring this approach to a variety of different areas. I think the initial area was, challenging parking tickets, and then I think he did some things for I think even homeless, to claim homeless benefits, and I saw that too, that you can sue anyone anywhere with this app. I think that's also an interesting idea. I think it helps you basically navigate through the forms that you need to fill in if you go to small claims court, and that's already, the courts are already trying to make that process pretty accessible and easy. And you could do this technically, going through the court's website and downloading the forms and so on. But if he puts a nice kind of interface and user experience on top of that, I think it will be even more accessible and viable for people to do that. And I think the pandemic has sort of created an environment where people, perhaps have a little bit more time, and they're really, and they're a little bit more, many people are sort of under financial stress too, and they're realizing like, oh, okay, well, Comcast still owes me money, and I've been kind of sitting on this, and because I didn't want to go through the trouble of like dealing with that, because it's painful and time consuming. So then services that make that, kind of pursuing your claims simple and easy are gonna fill a need in that space. So I think services like this will get a lift, but it's not something that's fundamentally new. I think overall, not just these legal chatbots, but overall, I think a lot of different legal technologies and innovations will be accelerated through the new conditions of the pandemic. So it's not like something groundbreaking new. These things have been in the pipeline for a long time, but now I think there's going to be a push and an acceleration towards adoption of some of those technologies. But we also have, so systems like, okay, so there's what Joshua does, and I'm definitely a cheerleader for what he's doing. I think he's really doing fantastic work in that space. There's other systems that have been out there for years in specific verticals, like there are systems to get recourse against airlines if they lose your luggage or they are delayed, and there are systems that make that very easy to pursue those claims that you would otherwise not pursue, because it's not viable for you to hire a lawyer at $500 an hour or whatever the rate is. And it's not a viable proposition for the lawyers themselves to take on small claims where they can get, $800 for your client. That's not a viable. And so that's where services like that come in, and they make it accessible to the main street consumer. And I think, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of merit to that. It's a growing field. I think that's where technology can do a lot. But then, there's also the whole area of sort of business to business kind of legal services, where there's a lot of innovation too, and sort of like how corporations, satisfy their legal needs, and they are also, trying to not be as dependent on the bespoke lawyering of their expensive outside law firms. And so a lot of innovations happening in corporate legal departments, where they, work more and more with innovative, third-party vendors, legal tech companies that are offering services to them and technologies to them that do things that were previously handled in a human kind of bespoke lawyering fashion by outside law firms.
I think that's a great point. I think it goes both ways, especially during this pandemic. It's not just the person trying to get their unemployment claims. It's also like the companies that are filing for bankruptcies and all the stakeholders. And it's really sort of a domino effect that this current situation is creating. So in terms of this whole area of legal innovation, besides everything that Joshua is doing and what's happening in the startup world, what do you see as like being the cutting edge in terms of legal technology? Like, what is the next big thing? Like what would you consider that to be?
That's a good question. So from our perspective, it's that area of computable law. Again, the sort of the automation and mechanization of legal analysis. There are separate branches in the field of computational law. So again, the rules-driven and data-driven approaches to doing things. And there's been a lot of excitement, particularly in recent years, around machine learning and natural language processing and deep learning, and how can you use these technologies to see patterns in contracts and analyze contracts more efficiently and things like that. And on the other hand, we have sort of a re-emergence of these rules-driven approaches that have been around for a long time in the form of expert systems and things like that. Think of like TurboTax being an example of a rules-driven computational law system. And these technologies, they have a little bit of a renaissance at the moment. First of all, because they're so useful in many areas. When the government, for instance, wants to make a certain kind of legal workflow more accessible to the citizens, how do you do that effectively? But then also, these kind of the data-driven technologies I just mentioned, they have their own issues, right? There might be applications and use cases of using these technologies in legal settings where it might not be clear how the technology comes to a specific, prediction, also a specific conclusion, because we don't know how the data were weighed and how what variables were taken into account. And that is in a legal setting is very problematic. It's maybe more problematic than if you use those technologies in advertising, other use cases. Because in legal settings, there are things that sometimes a person's liberty is at stake, or the person's ability to get a mortgage or a loan from the bank is at stake. So we want to know how these decisions are made, these automated decisions are made. And so that's where some of those, kind of rules-driven techniques come in to help us understand, where those technologies come together, and we can get more transparency into how certain decisions are being made by these automated decision-making systems. But so that's one of the sort of topics that are sort of on the cutting edge of legal informatics at the moment. So fairness, accountability, and transparency, and of algorithmic decision making, basically. So one other area I think that's a kind of a hot area that we're also focusing on in the center is the whole area of computable contracts. So these performing and self-executing contracts that are operationalizable. And there's been much talk about smart contracts in a blockchain context, but they are relevant in many other areas. It doesn't have to be on a blockchain. And there are issues around, how do we move the world of natural language contracting, where lawyers write these contracts in English, although hard to understand for non-lawyers. Even for many lawyers, it's hard to understand language, right? It's a very dense legal code. But how do you turn a world that's used to contracting in this way? How do you facilitate a transition towards creating contracts that computers can reason with, where computers can know what not just what the main entities are in a contract, but what are the obligations of the contract, and when does the computer have to perform certain obligations that arise under the contract. So that's an interesting area for us to study, and it's interesting because contracts are different from domain to domain, right? You may use some of the similar concepts, but they can be very different in health insurance versus car insurance or other startup investment. And so I think that's an interesting area too. And another area I think that's generally interesting is, like I said already, so there's coming together of the rules-driven and data-driven techniques. That's also in this area of chatbots is interesting, right? Where you first need to create a chatbot that understands kind of the rules of the law, but then you can see how people are using it, and you can gather the data and adjust the behavior of your chatbot. And that's an interesting kind of intersection area. So I think those are some of the interests, at least there's many more areas. Legal technology, legal innovation is sort of a broad umbrella, and there's several sub-branches, and there's people working on the latest legal information retrieval techniques for legal research and for e-discovery. And there's new techniques that help you, when you receive a complaint from the other party, then there's these kind of contextual search engines that already, retrieve the important cases that you need to know to answer to that complaint. Then there's these big data law techniques and computational law techniques that I mentioned to you. There's new technologies for managing your law practice, for teaming up with other lawyers in other parts of the world. And there's new online dispute resolution technologies also, which I think will also get a boost from the fact that people can't go physically to the courthouse. I think there will be innovation in that space too. But so there's a whole, I guess it's a long way of saying there's a whole bunch of different branches within legal tech. What I mentioned to you first, sort of computational law, computable contracts are the ones that we are currently focusing on quite a bit. Generally, the use of computational law in the enterprise and in different industries is of great interest to us. But there's other areas too that people are investigating actively.
I think our viewers definitely have a lot to sit on, because you mentioned so many exciting areas of research, especially kind of the theme that I'm seeing is this way to automate decision making. at both from high level to low level decision making. So could you
Exactly.
tell us about maybe some of the challenges behind like using these data-driven techniques or just rule-based techniques to automate these decisions? What sort of biases and potentially holdbacks will these systems initially experience?
So that's a great question. So one is one of the challenges in the law is that's a well-studied problem, is the so-called open texture problem. And I mean, I think that's how computer scientists call it. That basically means that, you know, the certain terms that you find all over the law that are sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally kept vague or ambiguous. You know, like what is a material breach, for instance, or what does it mean you're not allowed to have a vehicle in the park, and what's a vehicle, right? And when you automate, the human decision making, some things like, are very clear to us from a sort of human common sense point of view. Those are very hard to code for a computer to reason with. That's where the computer often gets stuck. You could say like, okay, well, this is hard to model the rules there, right? Because the law is kind of ambiguous, right? Or it's not very clearly defined, and you cannot define everything down to the, to make it so explicit that the computer can work with it. That's not practical, right? You could then say, okay, well, it's okay to have this term in this contract that says, okay, this, there's going to be recourse if this clause there's a material breach or non-performance, right? Then, okay, that's hard to reason with for a computer, but then you could leverage the data and see, okay, well, let me go through all the cases that have been decided before by the courts on this particular issue and see how they interpreted that specific word. And then that might help you clarify, ambiguous terms. So this is sort of technical challenge. And I think, that's an unresolved problem though still, right? You could potentially take this approach, but it doesn't work for everything.
Another thing, like, I was just going to comment that it seems almost like there's an incentive for people to write up contracts to fool these systems, to purposely put like ambiguous terms that have multiple definitions in like the legal terminology dictionaries, so the system cannot decipher like what the semantics actually are. And are you saying like that's the point at which we could rely on data and what sort of historical patterns can we take advantage of?
Well, I don't think people are purposefully doing this to kind of fool the systems. I think sometimes there's a good reason to use an ambiguous term, right? Like you might not want to define all the scenarios yet at this moment, what would be a breach in the future, because you want to see how the relationship between the parties evolve, right? And then, it's you don't necessarily you don't have the time to define everything, and you want to move forward on good faith with your counterparty, right? And so it's just not from a business point of view many times practical to define everything, right? And so that's one of the challenges. There's been much talk about sort of these advances in natural language processing that allow us to really better understand existing contracts that are written in legal language, a human language. But that's also still not at a point where the technology can really understand the legal arguments and the legal logic that that is in a document. That is called, this concept of legal argument retrieval is sort of at the forefront of kind of legal information retrieval research in legal informatics. So that is unresolved yet, and that's where some very smart people in the space are doing research. And so that's one of the challenges in automating many of the legal processes. What else? Let me see. What are some of the other challenges? Some of the other challenges are that in the legal space in particular, data are not, in many areas, are not readily available. Many of it's getting better, more and more data are available, but a lot of the data are also still behind paywalls and, services that don't make those data readily available. That's, for many people with great ideas in the space, that's a real challenge. And there's some, even sort of court data that should be owned by the public, right? Because it's the law of the land. But they are behind paywalls. There's a big sort of legacy system called Pacer that's selling information at a very, it's very costly. That's, a system that the government runs, or the judiciary actually is funded by that system to a large, much of the judiciary is funded by that system. And so, anyways, there's a big effort going on in making that legal information accessible, really accessible to the public, but it's not, it's currently not possible.
Yes, certainly. In tech, there's a general sentiment that we should just do our thing, and then when the government comes for us, we try to find ways around the government. But I think with law, it's very interesting how we want many of these private sectors to be innovating with all these frontiers, with the cooperation of the government. Having access to these data that right now are behind the government or behind paywalls and not readily accessible. So do you think that it'll be do you think there is potential for the private sector to get involved with those cutting edge frontiers of automated decision making, all these areas you talk about, or will it be more sort of within the walls of the government where this innovation happens?
No, I don't think it's in the walls of the government. I believe that the private sector, legal tech startups, are really the ones that are innovating in the space. It's a strategic decision for the entrepreneurs to decide, whether they take the, we take no prisoners kind of approach, and we do it and then ask for forgiveness later. I think that's a difficult thing to do. That's more difficult to do in sort of these legal tech use cases, because they're typically not the kinds of technologies where that create such a tremendous convenience, like Uber, for instance, that once you're established, then in a particular city, then the citizens of that city don't want to see that service go away anymore. And so then the governmental actors have a hard time really just, forbidding a specific service, right? I don't think, in law, we have, in legal tech, we have sort of a similar kind of mass market type of applications. There are certainly innovative companies that have been pushing the envelope, with regard to some of what we call gatekeeping regulations. Mm-hmm. So there are these gatekeeping regulations, that we call, for instance, unauthorized practice of law rules, that basically say that only human lawyers can provide legal advice. And so then the question is, do some of those automated services or robo-lawyer services, do they provide legal advice? And they fall, they run afoul these, UPL, unauthorized practice of law rules. And there's been litigation around that. The traditional line has always been, okay, only human lawyers can provide legal advice, but you can have a service that provides legal information. It's okay to provide legal information, but it's not always clear exactly where that line runs. And so that creates uncertainty for companies that have innovative ideas in that area. And so you might not, you don't want to run the risk necessarily to have the government shut down your service. You're raising VC money, and you don't want to be shut down by the government or sort of the bar associations in that particular case. And then there's also another form of gatekeeping regulations that were developed in the legal system, is these so-called fee splitting rules. Lawyers can only share fees for legal services with other lawyers. And that's been a bit of an impediment for some of those corporations, these businesses that are trying to do some innovative things in that space. If they cannot share in the profits that are generated by dispensing legal advice, then that's not, sort of a viable business proposition to them. So anyway, so there are these regulations that have sort of kept, some innovations, from succeeding. As a legal technologist, I think it's maybe cumbersome to comply with some of those regulations, but you have to have, I think, a strategy that doesn't create a backlash, where you get sort of the government or other stakeholders, come after you and try to shut down your services. Anyways.
I think it'll definitely take a cooperative effort with the government and the private sector for innovation to flourish.
Yeah.
And I think your perspective coming from a legal technologist, having both experience with the law and with the private sector, I think really qualifies you to give these sorts of insights, which our viewers are definitely excited to hear. Mm-hmm. So I think we're just about on time. So I think Ken and I will end it right about here.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. I would say for computer scientists like yourselves, I think this is a fantastic area to apply your skills and your insights to. I think it's an area where you can have great impact, and it's an area with great entrepreneurial opportunity too. And I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity to be on your podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vogl.